Should Washington, D.C. become a state? People are having a say today as a Senate committee is holding a hearing on a bill that would grant statehood to the District of Columbia. Republicans say D.C. isn't large enough to be a state, but Democrats say residents of the district deserve equal representation. Well, joining us now with more on the push for D.C. statehood is Stephen Webster, an assistant professor of political science at Indiana University. Professor Webster, thank you so much for joining us. First up, explain why the Founding Fathers established the District of Columbia as a federal area, not a state.
So this goes back to some of the developments in the founding of our country. We wanted to have a sort of neutral area that would be the capital of the United States. This was also geographically in the middle of the country at the time between the North and the South. So as with most cases in American history, this was largely a division between free states and slave states. And this was essentially a compromised position.
Now, if D.C. were to become a state, would that jeopardize that goal of it being neutral? Would it jeopardize the federal government in any way or national security in any way?
So I don't think it would. I think in a lot of ways, D.C. operates as a state without actually having the benefits of statehood. Right? Citizens in D.C. pay taxes. They vote in presidential elections. They serve in the military. So in a lot of ways, D.C. Is a state without having the rights and benefits of statehood.
And you bring up a good point right there. You know, supporters of the D.C. statehood say that the people who live there deserve equal representation. And right now, as I understand it, they only have a non-voting member in Congress. Is that unfair to those residents to not have a voting member?
You know, it's certainly a unique situation. Residents of the District of Columbia would tell you that it's unfair. In some ways, they have a subpar form of representation. You've correctly noted that they have a delegate to the United States Congress, but this delegate cannot vote on any legislation. So they are, sort of disadvantaged here compared to the rest of the country. And I think that's a big reason why residents of D.C. are really pushing for statehood right now.
And opponents kind of bring up the whole geography thing because, you know, D.C. isn't really that large. They say it's not large enough to be a state, and it would also end up being a state within a state if it keeps its geographic area right there. Does that matter? Does the geography matter when it comes to statehood?
So there's a lot of requirements around statehood. You can't take territory from one state and make it a new state without the permission of the original state. And so people debate about whether this is something that would inhibit statehood for D.C. Many people suggest that because D.C. is land that is no longer a part of Virginia or Maryland, this sort of complication would not arise. And so really the debate around whether D.C. should be its own state or not largely falls along political lines.
And let's talk about that. That was my next question, because a lot of folks are concerned about if D.C. were to become a state, it might tip the balance of power to Democrats. Is that a fair assessment? Would that be an issue?
So it wouldn't change anything in terms of the Electoral College, right? With the passage of the 23rd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, residents of D.C. have been able to vote in presidential elections. So nothing would change there. What would change is the sort of balance of power in the House of Representatives and the Senate, at least potentially. This would give D.C. one voting member of the U.S. House, and it would give D.C. 2 senators. So to the extent this would change any political dynamics, it would be in the halls of Congress rather than in voting for president.
But it certainly would change that balance of power. So there is some argument or validity to that argument there. In order to make this happen, what has to happen? Is it just a vote in Congress and it becomes a state, or is there more to it than that?
So Section 4 of the United States Constitution gives Congress the power to decide what territory is allowed to become a new state. Traditionally, states have first been territories, and territories vote saying they would like admission to the Union as a new state. When this happens, Congress passes what is known as an enabling act, and this sets forth a series of requirements that Congress wants this potential new state to meet. Now, what requirements are included varies on a case-by-case basis, but what we traditionally see is that potential states have to draft a state constitution and form a government that is congruent with the United States Constitution. If this happens and Congress accepts these developments, then they can pass an act of admission. This would require a simple majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then the president's signature. If this happens, this new territory would become a new state into the Union.
Okay, well, that certainly clears up a lot for us, and there's a lot to go through before this happens, and we will, if we have more questions about it, we'll certainly call on you again. Thank you so much, Professor Stephen Webster, Assistant Professor of Political Science at IU. Thank you so much for the time and clearing this up for us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.